Absolutely. And the thing is as being the big tech companies controlling the data and controlling the voice, they're really able to implement a lot of power. I mean, if we look back in the Roman days and that sort of thing, the way that power was implemented was through things like religion.
Hmm.
And if you could control the mindset, you can control the belief pattern, you can control the outcome of what somebody's doing on a daily basis. And I think a lot of the new movements, whether it's a tech movement or whether it's a social belief movement, are really almost being treated like religion. and
Yeah.
and people replace or augment the religion with those types of beliefs. And we're seeing this hybrid between religion and politics. And I
Hmm.
kind of want to talk a little bit about that with you. And welcome back to the Money, the Mindset, and the Mentoring podcast. Today, we have Bryan Kuderna on the podcast, on the show. He is the author of What Should I Do With My Money? He is a CFP, and he's also the host of the Kuderna podcast. Bryan, I had an absolute pleasure listening to your book as I was traveling to Vegas last week and going through all the details in it. You really are holistic in the way that you look at what should I do with my money. I've never seen this perspective before. And I really want to dive. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about, so I want to dive in really quickly. So, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I'm excited to have the conversation, and thank you for the kind words. That's
Oh,
that's what I was trying to do with the book. So
yeah, it was amazing. It was like, so first of all, when people think about what should I do with my money, they're going to look at the book and they're going to go, number one, boring. All it's going to do is talk about, should I go into mutual funds? Should I go into real estate? Should I go into Bitcoin? But your book really dives into everything else that's just really not that.
yeah,
And
exactly.
so let's talk a little bit about the opening of the book.
Sure.
How it talks a little bit about you as a person, and then it talks about the world around it. So I won't steal your thunder on it. Just let's get
Yeah,
going.
yeah. I think that was kind of the impetus behind it was, money just invades every aspect of life, whether you like it or not. And so when I kind of came up with the idea for the book, I was thinking from a personal standpoint, as a financial advisor, I'm meeting with people, having conversations all day long, every day for 15 years now about their money and their finances. And it so quickly goes from like a financial planning meeting to like a therapy session. And it without fail, whether it's business partners, life partners, husband and wife, talking about what keeps them up at night or what bothers them and how to take control of their money. That's what I do every day. And that's kind of like the micro standpoint. But then these conversations, they involve every time global issues. And so that's what I always tell people is you start to, whether you like economics or not, economics is like the psychology of money. And so when you blend the micro and the macro, which is what I tried to do with my book, that's ultimately what happens is you start to see like, okay, there's this story that money tells that we don't always understand. But when we start to see it, then it's almost like we kind of took the magic pill from the Matrix where now we see everything and it all starts to make sense. And that's what I wanted to do with the book.
Well, I think the first thing what you do in the book is you start defining what is money,
Hmm.
and you talk a little bit about money and how it relates to exchange, value. Talk a little bit about that because I thought that was a really interesting spin.
Yeah, I think one of the things, if you kind of talk about that intro, is really like price versus cost.
Yeah.
So whenever people are making any economic decision, whether it's, hey, are we going to go buy pizza tonight or should we go to the steakhouse? Or, on a global stage, do we want to get our oil from Russia or are we going to talk with Saudi Arabia? You look at these things and the price is always the known. All right, that's the easy part that like you see broadcast on TV that, okay, oil costs X per barrel this morning. Let's make a decision on that. But cost is the one that's so much deeper of if we make that decision, if I want to take my wife out to get pizza, does it save me a few bucks? But then, could we had so much more fun having lobster tails and, just a night to remember? There's the underlying kind of value there that isn't just printed out as dollars and cents. And I think you have to recognize that whenever you start to look at any decision, you want to dig a little bit deeper and see what are those kind of ancillary effects to that. And that's where all the intricacies of cost come in versus price just being something that's easy and definable. And then when we get into value of how we actually make decisions, we make decisions based on cost, not on price. That's where something to you could be really expensive, where to me it's a bargain because maybe it's something I really, really want that I love. and you feel a different way about whatever that object is. And so I think those are the things that start to kind of like pull back the curtain on how people make financial decisions.
Yeah, I think you kind of break down it into the two categories. I don't think you specifically use these words, but the idea of quantitative and qualitative value, and in the
Mhm.
sense of impact. And I think that's something that was really interesting as you started to develop the sort of the framework for which to start to define, what to do with my money.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's that kind of tells the story. You got to understand the why behind everything, and it's not. I mean, if it was as easy as dollars and cents, it would just be such a simple, computer operated world. But when we start to figure out, like, well, why did they do that and not this? That's where these questions have a lot more layers to them, and that's where we just start to dive in headfirst to economics.
And diving a little bit deeper into the economic side of things, then we start to branch out in the idea of, instead of that macro or so that micro transaction of I'm going out and buying a slice of pizza, but saying what's happening behind the scenes when you buy that slice of pizza, and then all the other things that it impacts on those decisions, where you start talking about, a little bit about dynamics that are outside of you, such as, I mean, one of the great ones I thought that you hit was population. And you
Mhm.
did such an interesting play around immigration, emigration, and that sort of thing. So if we bump up from the individual up to sort of the macro level, let's start talking about that and just really start hitting on that one. And population was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, no, I think it was. It's something that fascinates me as well. And one thing I would tell your listeners, there's a essay out there, and I believe it's called I Pencil. I don't know if you ever heard of that. It's something pencil. And what it is the guy writes, you just think of a pencil as such a simple, ordinary object.
Oh
But if you
yes,
start to dive into like, how did that pencil get here? It's absolutely amazing to see all the different, ways that you have to kind of build and source these materials and put them together. You touch almost every continent and every government just to create this little pencil. And I think that really encapsulates what economics is. And so
absolutely.
when we take that mindset and then, like you said, introduce like, all right, not just us in our household, in our village, but the international scene. I had read in the way that I got to this, a little kind of make a long story a bit longer. I had read, I believe it was either Inferno or Origin by Dan Brown. I don't remember. It was one of those two. And he has a graph in there that shows, the history of population. And you don't know what it is at first. When they introduce it in the book, it just shows this graph that's kind of flat for like millennia, and then it spikes straight up. And it is like a really good teaser of like, what could this be? And then ultimately you find out that that's actually the history of population. And that stuck with me. It left such a mark because I was like, wow, that's a chart that like is unbelievable. But when you look at it, kind of this doubling effect of how long it took the world to get to 1 billion people. And then how quickly we went from a billion to 2 billion, 2 billion to 4 billion, and now up to 8 billion. It's almost like in the blink of an eye when you think about the scale of history. And so that enormous and very, very rapid expansion of population is ultimately what's created the entire environment that all of us know today, and has led to, the highest standards of living in history. However, it's also introduced a lot of negatives along the way too that we have to account for. And so that's what I kind of say is, this whole economic conversation is just a play that's being acted out on a stage. But the players are us, all the people that make up these 8 billion, kind of, bots making economic decisions together. And so I just thought it was incredible, like how quickly things are changing. And if you know a little of that history, it starts to make sense to say, okay, this is why things are the way they are.
Well, and that goes into the next thing about when you talk about planning for the future, because you have to look at where things are today, but where things are going into the future. And you talk about the highest level of standards that we have today for, we'll call it first world countries.
Sure.
But then we also have the thing is, in those first world countries, we have different levels of success in those first world countries, because we have a meritocracy. I mean, not everybody's going to win. There's going to be
Mhm.
winners and there's going to be losers. In your book, you say there's going to be givers, then there's going to be takers. And
Yeah.
so I want to talk a little bit about that element when you start talking about the entitlement systems.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when I talk about givers and takers, the way I just kind of boiled it all down is that you have givers to society, you have givers to the economy, and those are the ones that are producing. All right. So the easiest way to look at that is we're actually in our working years of our career. All right. That's probably what it's most synonymous with, in that I'm going to work every day, I'm creating value, I'm adding value, I may be paying taxes, I might be inventing some new technology, I might be helping, I might be curing someone, whatever my role is, I'm a producer and I'm giving to the world. Then you have takers on the other side of the coin. And all of at some stage of life are a giver or a taker. All right. When we're an infant or when we're going through primary school, we're a taker. Okay. We're not making some huge contribution to society. We're learning from our elders at that point. When we are elders and in our last stages of life, again, we're a taker. Okay. If I'm in an assisted living facility, I'm not producing, I'm taking from Medicare, from Medicaid, from these different systems in the healthcare system to take care of me now. And so that's where you have this give and take throughout life. And it's a scale. And when that scale becomes ever out of balance, that's when we start to have these questions of how can we come back to center? And that's so much what life is about, is kind of bring it back to center so we have this homeostasis and everything kind of moves forward. And now as we get into population, you'll see this not just in America, but around the world, is the dynamics are changing of demographics. And you're hitting, I won't call it a crisis, but what some will call an aging crisis. All right, where you're having more and more people that by just virtue of aging are entering that taking sector and leaving the giving sector, and we're not replacing it quick enough. And
Yeah.
so that's where, as we start to get to entitlements and everything else, there's again a trickle down effect that it's there. I think it's apparent, but we're turning a blind eye to it, and it's going to have big consequences to us
Well, I
that we
think
can't ignore.
when you look at it, and I think the narrative is being spoken around the world around this in some shape or form. I was just at a conference in Vegas with Tony Robbins was there. It was a Keller
Okay.
Williams conference, and he talked just about this specifically, saying that there's a seasonality in everybody's life. He called it the spring, a summer, a fall, and winter.
Mhm.
And along the same lines of that, when in that early growth mode of, as you say, taking, and then you're into that, sort of, builder mode, and then that reaping what you sow mode, which is the fall, and then the winter is when you really need that, you're at that other chapter.
Mhm.
And so the idea is to bring that all together with a good line from Game of Thrones: "Is winter is coming," and we have that with a certainly society right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where, like, as a financial advisor, I'll have a lot of millennials or young professionals come to me, and they bring up this thing. It's not super popular, but I've just heard about it in industry, called the FIRE movement. And that stands for financially independent, retire early. And the concept, if you really drill down into it, is to actually retire by the age of 40. And I'm just telling, I hate the concept. I'll start with that. And when I tell people, when they bring it to me, not only is it a tall order, and I think leads to a lot of irrational decision making, but if it actually does work in reality, you got to recall that we're entering the workforce right now way later than our parents or grandparents did. Okay. We're the most educated generation in history. And that's only going further in one direction of more and more education, whether it's through, undergrad or grad degree, et cetera. And then we're, entering the workforce maybe at 25 years old, where our parents or grandparents were at it at 17 or 18. Okay. And then meanwhile, if we think, all right, the normal retirement age has been bumped up to 67, but we're talking about how can we cash out at 40, you're seeing more and more of the population with the ability to spend more years in retirement than in their career. And if that's the case, if we go back to givers and takers, again, that's where that scale will get out of whack. And if that's okay, if we want to let it get out of whack, that's fine. But then we can't fool ourselves and say, well, we can allow these systems we created, 70 years ago to operate unimpeded. That's just not realistic.
Well, I think the other idea is that mental health, when you look at the idea that you're saying, I'm in it to get out as quickly as possible,
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about that, because you're looking at saying, I'm not looking at, there's a guy, Grant Cardone, he was interviewed on a podcast with Graham Stephan, and was asked, do you want your daughter to be happy? He's this billionaire guy who does these sales trainings and owns all this real estate, yada, yada, yada.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter. But what matters is he asked, do you want your daughter to be happy? And he says, no, I want my daughter to be productive. And it's a really interesting concept, because if somebody goes in the idea that at 40 I just want to exit the giver element and start getting into the taker mode, I'm not sure if that's the right mindset, unless it's saying that I want to move into the stuff that I want to do to get into the things that I don't want to do. Maybe that's a little bit of a different perspective. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, you got to be useful and you got to be productive. And I think those then segue right into a sense of worth and a sense of happiness. So yeah, if the idea is, let me just cash out as soon as I can, that I always tell my clients, I'm like, that's okay if you're going to pivot into something else. If it's a means to an end to then go chase this real encore career that's maybe your passion, and you do want to write that book, or you want to found your foundation, have a nonprofit, whatever it is, okay, that's real. But if it's just to kind of check out and veg out in the sun on an island, it's like, what was that for? I listened to recently an interview with Jeff Bezos from Amazon, and he said, when we all fast forward way down the line and we're laying on our deathbed and we want to look back at our life's work, we can look back and say, hey, I had a lot of fun and I took it easy. Or you can look back and say, man, like I really grabbed onto life and I got the most I could out of it. And I had a lot of ups and downs and a lot of challenges, but I'm proud of what I did. Which of those two would you rather be? I don't know many people that are like, yeah, I'd want to just sit there and be like, yeah, I took it pretty easy.
Yeah, it's a different mindset. And that leads to the idea of how is someone being supported externally through their mentors, or through the people, their parents, their friends, or through the educational system.
Mm-hmm.
Is our system teaching people that the idea that you need to work to 40 and retire into the FIRE program, or is it teaching them you need to build a legacy?
Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk a little bit about the education system and some concerns around that.
Sure. Yeah. And that's, then I believe that was the third chapter in my book. So that came right after entitlements, is ultimately how do we kind of formulate all these concepts that get ingrained in us? And then we feel in essence, almost entitled to them, whether they're good or bad. We only know what we know. And that comes through education, whether it's formal and informal. So we're having a big shift. Again, all this stuff is apparent, to have more and more formal education, which comes at an enormous price tag. Okay, if you just look at the rate of tuition, the inflation rate of tuition, room and board, through the roof. Okay, I'm doing this now with our kids. You go visit, college campuses and stuff, and then lo and behold, every single one is a construction site with the newest and greatest buildings and facilities. And so, who pays for all that? Okay, if you want to ask the parent and then eventually the young professional via student loan debt, you're going to fund all of this. All right, bear in mind, you're not just paying for an education, you're paying for an experience. And you got to ask yourself, what is really the value in that experience if the results that we want is just a productive career? We better be able to connect the two. If we can't, that's when we know that there's kind of pork involved in this. There's fluff, there's extras that aren't really of value. And I think that's what people really need to look at. Now, on a macro standpoint, you talk about the student loan pandemic. The current administration wanted to do so much for borrowers. They want to forgive. That all sounds great at face value. But when essentially we take this $2 trillion of student loan debt, and if we were just to hypothetically wipe the slate clean, okay, yeah, that will relieve a burden on the individuals, the young professionals with that debt. But also it's giving the green light to these institutions that not only are hardworking parents paying for this, but the U.S. government that backs all this debt is paying for it. And we have a huge debt owed that we just wipe clean. We're saying, go spend more. Go
100%.
spend more, raise the tuition higher. Okay, forget if these people can pay it or not, because we'll come in and we'll bail them out. It communicates a really bad message that financial prudence is not of value, that we don't really need to have these real life conversations because there's going to be this contingency plan. And that's what introduces moral hazard. in economics, where you say, all right, the rational person would decide X, but I'm not going to do that because there's some other way that I can kind of get an escape or a bailout. And now all of a sudden I start to act irrationally. And
Well,
if we
and
are
anything
that,
that
it's not good.
absolutely anything that lacks causality, where you can make a decision and you're not going to see any implications of that bad decision presenting in the result. It leads to, just horrible. I mean, we saw this in the banking space. You see this in companies that just get bailouts all the time. They just get so fat with all these systems and processes that are completely not required. We see governments do this all the time.
Yep.
In Canada, I think it's some stupid percentage of the number of the population, like near 50% of the government, 50% of the population works for the government in some shape or form.
Yeah,
And which is just a crazy number. And then if you take it to that level, the next natural question, and we're going to get into a hot zone in a minute, is talking about the differences between an entitlement, socialism, and a earned privilege, capitalism, and kind of talk between those two, because they both, I mean, I think personally speaking, I think they both have some inherent merits, but they also have big pitfalls. And I kind of want to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where, and not to sell the book, to plug it too much here, but I can't encourage people enough to read that chapter on economic philosophy. And the reason that I say that is because I think socialism and capitalism are not appropriately defined. And a lot of people, they hear one of them and they think of them as beliefs of, okay, I'm either on this side or I'm on that side. Kind of like the Democrat Republican thing. I need to stake my claim. And then once I'm there, it's like this immovable object where I believe in it. I have a grounded belief in this system and you cannot move me off of this rock. And that's dangerous when you find that, in politics or economics. So in capitalism and socialism, I think one of the first things people want to realize is in the States, we are a blended economy, right? There are parts of us that are very socialist. Okay. We have, healthcare that receives subsidies. We have education that everybody's entitled to. Okay. We have entitlement programs, the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. None of these things just stand on their own merits. They receive a lot of government assistance. All right. And hence a lot of the debt that we have. Then, of course, we have capitalism. We have the biggest, most profitable companies in the history of mankind operating right here in the States. So we're this blended economy that if we can take the best of both worlds, it's doable. But if you look at the course of history, particularly since World War II, we have steadily moved in one direction, and that is towards the socialist side. Okay. Some people like that. Some people don't. I don't want to be the one to pass judgment. What I tried to do in my book is just provide the empirical evidence of when we want to take a socialist step, what's the cost to that? It's not free. Someone is going to pay for that, period. All right. And then when we take a capitalist step, that's essentially, I want to keep what I earn and I want to compete. Okay. Now, some people will argue on that. Well, that naturally is going to promote, aggressive behavior. I'm going to cut corners. Maybe I'll operate, on the border there in that gray area to try and outdo my competitor. And so then that introduces, well, we need a rule set. We need a referee here. And so that's where you have kind of this tug of war between the two, which is okay. But when I say the government comes in and says, I want to weight it one way or the other, that gets dangerous. And that's where we are right now. And, we've gotten more and more socialist, and that is just purely looking at numbers.
Well, I think if you look at rather than saying left or right, it's more layered. So it's almost like one of those cakes with all those different flavors in it. And I think I was in Las Vegas, I had a 12-layer cake. It was epic. I paid for it the next day, but yeah, it was good. But the idea is that you can layer those things, and each are going to bring a little bit of value on one side or the other. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting when you look at, say, the socialist movement, we see this heavily played in the technology sector. So a lot of the big companies really lend heavy onto the socialist mentality.
Sure.
But they run with a very capitalist objective.
100%.
And you talked a little bit about the aggressive tendencies. So I want to talk a little bit about technology. I want to talk a little bit about warfare and kind of get into this element here.
Yeah, definitely. And as you can see, these kind of open up a lot of Pandora's boxes, if you will. And so that's, again, why I encourage people to look at the book, because there is a lot of data in there, but I tried to kind of massage it and make it all make sense. But with technology, I mean, that is the wave of the future. Tech, that's the whole idea, is that it wants to be something new. It wants to be something innovative and make life faster and easier. That's why it exists, is so that if we have good technology, in a way, it can allow us to be a little bit lazier. All right. Or on the pro side, it can allow us to apply our efforts elsewhere because technology has already checked those boxes. So I love tech. I love everything about it. I love advancement. I love progress. But when you have such a concentration of wealth as we have in tech, if we look at the Magnificent Seven, we look at what is carrying the stock market today. All right. It's not just the NASDAQ, it's the huge companies at the top. All right. It's your Amazon, your Alphabet, your NVIDIA, all these, they all have one commonality, which of course is tech. Not only does money give them a lot of ability to expand, but it gives them a huge voice that the rest of us don't have. And you're exactly right that you look at Zuckerberg or Bezos or Bill Gates, they're all saying something. They don't want to just make any more money. All right. They want to have an impact with their voice right now. That's as clear as day. And you're right. They have all leaned a little bit more towards the socialist side, which I don't know sometimes if it's a guilty conscience of, if I'm the richest man in history, I'm worth tens and tens of billions of dollars, I'm going to go tell the world how to be socialist and to spread their wealth. That certainly sounds
And then
hypocritical.
buy another yacht.
Yeah, yeah. Meanwhile, while they buy a $350 million yacht, it sounds kind of silly when you think about it. But yeah, I mean, these guys, I mean, they control the modes of communication, and so they wield a lot of power. And I think that's something that as a consumer, we always have to think when we hear something or see something, what's the motive behind that? All right. How did that get filtered before it got to us to be able to read or see it? And tech guy, the big tech guys are usually the answer there. They're
Well, the
almost
thing,
gatekeepers.
absolutely. And the thing is as being the big tech companies controlling the data and controlling the voice, they're really able to implement a lot of power. I mean, if we look back in the Roman days and that sort of thing, the way that power was implemented was through things like religion.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could control the mindset, you can control the belief pattern, you can control the outcome of what somebody's doing on a daily basis. And I think a lot of the new movements, whether it's a tech movement or whether it's a social belief movement, are really almost being treated like religion. And
Yeah.
and people replace or augment the religion with those types of beliefs. And we're seeing this hybrid between religion and politics. And I
Mm-hmm.
kind of want to talk a little bit with that with you.
Sure. Yeah, I know that was one of the chapters. A lot of people were like, man, I just went to Barnes and Noble and I bought a book called What Should I Do with My Money? And then boom, you have this big chapter on religion. Like, how does that fit in? And it's kind of to the point of what you said. And maybe to set the stage, one of the things that I think garnered the most attention out of the book was an acronym that I use throughout that I love called MICE,
Yeah.
which is money, ideology, compromise, and ego. These are these four motives or these four triggers that make us do what we do every day. And when you dig into ideology, kind of the definition of self, all right, so much of that when we look at why do I define what's important to me? If we go all the way back in time, it's not just, oh, well, I'm an American or I'm Chinese or I'm from Jersey, you're from California. It starts to go deeper and we look at, religion being, one of the oldest forms of ideology, okay, is theology. And so if you look even now, here we are in the 21st century, the conflicts that are going on, whether you talk Israel and Palestine, all right, or you talk about, a lot of the governments, how they're run in the Middle East versus our government in the USA, so much is grounded in religious principle. All right. And then that has a trickle effect, like everything else, into economics. And also, how these economies and these governments decide to do business together. So it's really, really unique and interesting, I think, when you kind of dive into how religions work and the history of them, and then see the political influence that they've had, or vice versa, that political influence has had on religion. It's really quite fascinating. And that's why I put it in the book as a chapter that kind of, explains in a lot of ways, why have certain conflicts arose? Why are certain governments, operated the way that they are? There's a religious principle in a lot of them. And you're right, what you were talking about, like in the tech sector. Again, think of tech almost as like the mode of communication. And then if ideology is really what we're trying to communicate, well, guess what? Then religion's going to creep in very quickly.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at even if you look at the Bible and how it gets interpreted in very different ways, it could be how the Bible was printed, because the printing press was the really the way things were disseminated in a massive scale. And when that came out, and you could rewrite what was written, or you could disseminate. Say you're the apostle who's sort of going around in that area, you could disseminate a little bit differently. That's exactly, they're taking just a page out of history in what they're doing.
Sure. Yeah, 100%. And so then that comes down to the consumer. When we tie in the micro and the macro, it's like, well, if we like that, if we appreciate that, then okay, we can kind of jump on this bandwagon and keep the train moving in that direction. If we don't, if we're saying I disagree with not being able to have a voice, or that what they're promoting, it isn't jiving with the way that I feel, then that's where we have to get involved and have influence. And that brings back the whole giver and taker conversation of, well, how do I have influence? Is it where I'm investing my money? Is it who I'm voting for? Is it the workplace that I'm going to every day? We have to start to kind of look into these things and see how, one small voice can become a big voice when it becomes many. And I think that's where all this starts to tie together. And then the unfortunate reality for many is when they say, well, what's the lifeblood that's weaving through it all? It's money.
It's money. Okay? Absolutely.
And that's where it comes right back to the book and why every chapter is the way that it is.
Well, when and I'm an Audible guy, and I listened to the book, and I took off in a plane, and I listened to the book, and then I came down on landing. So it's almost like our conversation today is we took off and we hit a lot of really high value things up in the sky of the things that can impact. But now as the plane's landing and we're coming down, and we got to make decisions where we're going as the individual, and we're trying to figure out how do we set that roadmap going forward. What's some quick and key takeaways that somebody can go when they start focusing on personal finance?
Yeah, so that was the very last chapter of the book, is on personal finance, because I always say first you got to kind of understand the rules of the game, how it's played, so that you can see the thing and say, okay, I get it. That's really what the whole crux of the book was about. Then we say, all right, now speaking to you, what can you do so that you can essentially become more powerful for your own well-being and whatever it is you're trying to do? And if we think money's the lifeblood, then let's teach you how to get really good with money. And that's where I introduce kind of what I do as a professional. And some of the things that I talk about there, really just to boil it down, I guess, there's a quick 4-step process that I like to coach people on. And it goes protection first. All right. You can't be exposed, because if we are, at some point, life's going to hit you in the face. And if you're not ready, everything that you have or that can get thrown for a whirlwind. So protect yourself first, build liquidity, understand that cash is king. Keep things simple, build a good budget, build that rainy day fund. I always say save, try 20% of your gross income. You do that, you're going to get on the fast track. Some of those just kind of quick bullets. And then high interest debt is number 3. Get that under control and eliminate it. All right. It's kind of like we're building that mega yacht that we're talking about. But if it got leaks in it, we're only as strong as our weakest link there. So we can't have progress while we have these headwinds of credit card debt or whatever it might be, just weighing us down throughout life. And then the 4th step is going to be wealth accumulation. Okay. That's the fun stuff, the investing, the how do I make my money more money? And I love getting there. I love that conversation, but it's the 4th for a reason. Everybody comes to me as the CFP and says, I want to do that 4th one. I want to go invest in Bitcoin or whatever. That's great. We're going to do that, but you got to protect yourself. You got to be liquid, and we got to get rid of those bad debts. Otherwise, it's kind of like we're having fun over here with the good stuff, but meanwhile, we're bleeding ourselves dry over here. And so that's where you got to kind of bring it all together in totality. And, that's just an entree to what we do on the personal finance.
I love it. I love it. I mean, my wife was a paramedic for 15 years, and the whole thing for her was protect yourself first before you can go help somebody else. And I think that concept from a financial perspective, I think is huge. Bryan, I've had an absolute pleasure not only reading your book, well, listening to your book, and having this conversation and just really kind of getting out the meat and potatoes of things. If people want to buy the book, would they go? Where would they go to grab it? And
Yep. Yeah, it's wherever books are sold, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's everywhere. It's published by McGraw-Hill, obviously enormous reach. So it's out there and it's available paperback, Kindle, or audiobook, like you said.
beautiful, beautiful, Bryan. Awesome having you on the show. This is the money. This is the mindset. This is the mentoring podcast, and we'll see you guys on the next one.
Thanks, Steve.